I think I'll make a start. Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Maggie Goodall. She works at Humanist UK and is their Humanist Heritage Coordinator, and has been amassing quite an impressive array of information on various societies who are of humanist persuasion. And particularly, she's going to be talking this evening about the Hampstead Humanist Institute. It became a slightly different name eventually, but the reason for doing so is that it has a very good archive, and will give you a very good indication as to how things are with that kind of information. Very much looking forward to your talk, Maddie. So I think I will hand over to you, if that's okay with you, and hope you all enjoy the talk.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and thank you for having me as well. So this talk, as Ruth said, draws on research that's been carried out as part of what is called the Humanist Heritage Project, which was launched in 2019 to mark the 125th anniversary of Humanists UK, which was last year in 2021. My research has centred on the history and influence of the non-religious in the UK, so looking at both the charity itself and the longer history of humanism, secularism, atheism, free thought, and all of the kind of comparable or linked philosophies and ways of thinking. Humanist UK itself started life as what was called the Union of Ethical Societies, which was formed in 1896 by a federation of the North, South, West and East London ethical societies. But these emerged into and out of an existing tradition of humanist and secularist ideas, which included the rational religion of the kind of proto-socialist Owenites, the earthly emphasis of the secularist movement, and also the positivist religion of humanity. These in turn drew on a tradition of humanist thought, which is really as old as humanity itself, and aspects and also individuals from all three of these major free-thinking movements recur in what would come to be known as the ethical movement, which is what kind of groups all of the things I'm talking about today, and ultimately becomes known as the humanist movement. Camden, as is probably little surprise for all of you, was a hotbed of humanist and progressive activity, which is something that I know Rosalind Aben drew on in her talk, which she gave last year, A Working Class Couple Discovers Progressive Hampstead, 1936 to 38. And she actually mentioned the Hampstead Ethical Institute or the Hampstead Humanist Society. And so this talk kind of covers similar scenes, comparative groups, but perhaps about a generation or two later than the ones I'll be looking at, which are in the earlier part of the 20th century. So to start with, because I know that it's not something that's necessarily familiar to everyone or obvious necessarily, is a definition of the word as I'm using it here. So humanism, as I'm talking about it, is a variety of ethical theory and practice characterized by a stress on human rationality, capacity for free thought and moral action, and a rejection of theistic religion and the supernatural in favor of secular and naturalistic views of humanity in the universe. It's essentially a non-religious school of thought and philosophy for being, which is more than merely saying that you're atheist or agnostic. And as I say, this has got a long tradition, but these things that are highlighted are all aspects which kind of recur when you look at the longer history of the movement itself. What would become the ethical and later the humanist movement in the UK began in 1876 in America with the birth of the ethical culture movement, which was founded by Felix Adler in New York with the motto "Deed, not creed," or not by the creed, but by the deed. Adler was the son of a rabbi, and he was particularly influenced by two kind of key philosophical ideas. One, the impossibility of proving or disproving the existence of God, and also the concept of self-reliance. And he brought these together in the concept of the Ethical Culture Society, which was based on the idea that people of all beliefs and no religious belief could come together and work to create a better society. And he himself was a very active social reformer, as well as being a philosopher and a leader of the ethical culture movement as it became. These ideas filtered through both by direct influence and in literature, and that led to the formation of the first British Ethical Society in London in 1886, which was followed fairly rapidly by a number of others. And these included South Place Ethical Society, which is now Conway Hall at Red Lion Square, which had begun as a dissenting congregation in the 1700s. They rejected the doctrine of eternal damnation. And it evolved over subsequent centuries through Unitarianism and ultimately to humanism. That became an ethical society in 1888 with the arrival of another American called Stanton Coit, who had been directly mentored by Felix Adler in the US, and who would act as really a driving force in the early UK humanist movement. In 1896, 4 London societies united to form the Union of Ethical Societies, which I mentioned before, to which many more societies would become affiliated over the years. There were ultimately over 70 individual ethical societies throughout the UK, which all focused on living well without reference to supernatural ideas. In 1920, it's worth saying because the name changes a lot, the Union of Ethical Societies became the Ethical Union. In 1967, it became the British Humanist Association, and in 2017, it became Humanists UK. Now, Camden had its fair share of ethical societies, although some of them were the same group, but by different names. So you had the North London Ethical Society, the St Pancras Ethical Society, but the major players were the Leighton Hall Neighbourhood Guild, which I'll talk about in a moment, the North London Ethical Society, which kind of arose out of that, and the Hampstead Ethical Institute, which Ruth mentioned earlier, and for which good records remain, which is one of the reasons why it's kind of been particularly useful to me in researching the history of the early ethical societies as a whole, because by no means all of them have survived with similar levels of documentation. So Leighton Hall Neighbourhood Guild was in Leighton Crescent, Kentish Town, and this was an initiative of Stanton Coit, who I mentioned before, and it was based on the premise of streets or small areas forming guilds with various groups and activities that were part of them, and these included opportunities for education, socialising, and also entertainment. This was not dissimilar to the university settlement model, like that of Toynbee Hall, where university graduates lived alongside the urban poor in what was envisioned as a mutually beneficial arrangement. Coit had been directly inspired by Toynbee Hall actually some years earlier when he visited London, and he'd then introduced the settlement concept back home in America and founded the first settlement in the US. Coit founded his North London Neighbourhood Guild, so this Leighton Crescent Neighbourhood Guild, in 1889, and through it he developed a circulating library, Sunday afternoon free concerts, Sunday evening lectures, Saturday evening dances for members, a choral society, and 15 to 20 classes in various branches of technical and literary education. This originally occupied numbers 9 and 10 Leighton Crescent. You can see in this, the old map that's on here, if you start your counting from the right-hand side of the crescent, what is 9 and 10 are those buildings that are set back from the rest of the houses on that street. So these were 2 semi-detached houses which had a small hall behind them. And today this is the Luther Tyndale Memorial Church. And usefully, they've got a bit of a history on their website, which notes that their congregation bought the leasehold of the properties in 1901 at a cost of £800. They then moved their reverend into a flat upstairs at number 9, and a Sunday school was established on the ground floor. And usefully, this gives quite a good sense of how the buildings were probably used previously when the Leighton Hall Neighbourhood Guild occupied it, so from 1889 to 1901, when a number of key figures in the early ethical movement lived at what they referred to as Leighton Hall. In 1902, the hall at the rear of the property, which had been known as Lord Leighton's Music Hall, became a chapel. And in 1932, the congregation purchased the freehold for £1,400. And on the site of those two houses, built in 1938 what is the present day chapel. So those original houses don't exist anymore, although the rest of the crescent gives a very good indication of what the houses would have looked like. It's a really beautiful part, actually. And you can see from this quote here what Coit's vision for the neighbourhood guild was: binding friend to friend, helping towards the realisation of the duties of citizen to citizen, of the possibility of healthy pleasure without selfishness, of the deeper and soberer joys of life, of the power and cooperation, of the sweetening of life by a common life. And this was all very, very much a part of Coit's vision for the early movement, for the ethical movement itself, which was, as I say, bringing people together. Regardless of what it was they believed, there wasn't a requirement to believe or disbelieve in any god or anything else outside of it, but instead joined together for good deeds and for kind of personal growth and improvement. This programme of the Guild gives an idea of its character and also its emphasis. You might guess from some of the subjects of these, such as Herbert Burrows speaking on the ethics of socialism, and George Bernard Shaw on the iron law of wages. But Coit himself was very much part of the Labour movement. He did run unsuccessfully to be a Labour MP. And he, that kind of vision of socialism was also very much kind of intertwined. And other early figures in the ethical movement, such as James Ramsay MacDonald, were, of course, major figures in that too. So you can see that both, well, in fact, a number of these different societies or parts of the Guild were named after one man, Felix Michellis, who is pictured on the right here with his wife. Michellis was born in 1883 into a German Jewish family in London, and he was a painter and a peace activist and a promoter of the universal language of Esperanto. His wife, Margaret, or Greta, was also an artist, and she and Felix were very active in the international peace movement. He was president of the International Arbitration and Peace Association, and he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize an astounding 19 times. Pretty good, but he didn't win it, so but not for lack of trying, obviously. The Leighton Hall Guild and the ethical societies which sprung from it. So as I say, here it's referring to something called the Neighbourhood Guild Ethical Society, which doesn't get much reference elsewhere, but we know that the North London Ethical Society arose from this, and the St Pancras Ethical Society as well. Often there was kind of crossover in people, and some would potentially sometimes break off and form other groups that were closer to where they were living. So as I say, Camden had a number, but they are really interesting insights into the efforts of some of the founding figures of what is now Humanist UK. But the evidence of these is fairly fragmentary. Most of it, certainly most of the information about, for example, the Neighbourhood Guild here, comes from either bits and pieces in the archive of the British Humanist Association, which is held at the Bishopsgate Institute, or is referenced in Gustav Spiller's History of the Ethical Movement in Great Britain, which was published in the 1930s, and used all the material that was available to him at the time, and he himself had been an active participant, but for coming back to it now, it's a bit more difficult to get a real insight into, for example, who made up the membership of these groups. The difference, as Ruth mentioned, and as I said at the beginning, is that a couple of the societies we have much better records for, and the Hampstead Ethical Institute is one of these. The Hampstead Ethical Institute was founded in 1900, and you can see from this object that they adopted as a society in 1903, that the object of the society was to increase the knowledge, the love, and the practice of the right. Its bond of union is the belief that this object may be obtained without the aid of any theological sanction. This idea of the kind of the right, and increasing knowledge, and actually in some cases developing a kind of science almost of morality, was very much a part of the early movement. So it was quite typical in that way, but it was quite different and kind of individual in its other ways, which is one of the reasons that it's quite interesting. They came up with a declaration as well. And I've just highlighted some of the things again that were part of this declaration that are particularly, I suppose, interesting and representative as well of the movement as a whole. So in the second, we believe, they've got that moral fellowship is life and absence of it death. This is almost certainly drawing on William Morris's Dream of John Ball, fellowship is heaven and lack of fellowship is hell. And that idea of fellowship was central to the societies. We believe in granting women equal rights with men. Suffrage and suffragists in the group was a kind of ever-present theme, needless to say, particularly in those earlier years of the societies. Again, Stanton Coit himself was a major suffragist. His mother was a really prominent suffragist in his home state of Ohio, but huge numbers of both the kind of leaders of the movement and the members were actively involved in suffrage, and the organisation itself supported it. So Hampstead and the kind of overall group. Peace and internationalism was another quite big thing, and this comes out again in the membership of the Hampstead group itself. So they've got that they believe in international arbitration and federation, look upon war as unholy and destined to be abolished, and they believe in putting the questions: is it good? Is it true? Is it beautiful? Will it serve the Commonwealth? Democracy and political action. I mentioned that there was quite a strong crossover oftentimes with the early Labour movement, also the Liberal Party, there was quite a lot of crossover there. And this really varied between ethical societies, but they all, as a rule, believed in democracy and in political activism to achieve reform and a more just society. And importantly, and as I say, something that is, of course, a thread the entire way through, the belief in freedom of thought and belief. We believe in progress and in not clinging to ancient institutions and ideas unless they can justify themselves before the bar of reason and at the tribunal of conscience, which is a fairly dramatic way of saying it. But essentially, it's all about thinking for themselves and, if necessary, questioning established hierarchies. And that was, of course, a major thing emerging as they were from the 19th century, when there had been these huge changes to the way that people were thinking about things, thinking about science and religion in comparison or in relation to one another, and making sense of the world and how to live with one another, and how and on what basis to act morally as well. And this was very much a part of the early societies and of Hampstead Society in particular. The Hampstead Ethical Institute's first Sunday meeting was held on 29th of April 1900 at West Hampstead Town Hall initially, and meetings took place there until the end of May that year. The first 5 talks were by John Mackinnon Robertson, and they were on the lives of John Ruskin, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Matthew Arnold, Walt Whitman, and Herbert Spencer, which again, fairly typical of the ethical societies at the time. They were very interested in particularly these notable figures from history, and especially where they felt that they were sympathetic to or informing of the values that they were working towards. That's certainly the case for Emerson, Arnold, Whitman, and Spencer particularly. Robertson himself was a writer, a historian, and a politician, and he was a lecturer at South Place, as I say, now Conway Hall, as well as being the author of a short history of free thought, ancient and modern. And there was lots of this kind of travelling of lecturers between different societies. And in the same year as they were founded, the Ethical Society, or the Hampstead Ethical Institute, published a hymn book, a secular hymn book, called Hymns of Modern Thought. And in the preface to this, they, or rather Emily Josephine Troop, who was behind it, wrote, among distinguishing characteristics of the trend of modern thought are a growing faith in the capacities for good hidden within human nature, and conviction of the value of every hour of human life, and a poignant desire to make this life happier and better than a vale of tears. Spiritual aspiration there is much of in these pages, but it is aspiration towards the highest ideal of human goodness, and even the name of God as typifying this conception has been avoided. The gradual fading of the old ideas of heaven and hell has left untouched every worthy motive for striving towards goodness of heart and life, and no allusion to these ideas will be found among the selected poems. This is maybe especially interesting and sets Hampstead Ethical Institute apart in some way, because of what is a much more clear setting apart of themselves from the wider tendency of the movement. Stanton Coit, for example, loved to redefine or attempt to kind of repurpose religious terminology. So to redefine, for example, something like the concept of God to mean not a god or a distinct figure or an individual to be worshipped, but rather the values that we admire. So the good, the true, the beautiful. Whereas in this particular hymn book, Hampstead Ethical Institute are casting that aside. They're saying we're not interested in redefining even the concept of God. What we're leaving behind is these positive values that we're striving towards. We don't need to use those words. So their idea of modern thought is very much reflected in their hymn book. A number of ethical societies published secular hymn books, and the general means of doing so was to take bits of verse and prose and then set them to music. So a volume might include works from Walt Whitman, from Shakespeare, from Harriet Martineau, George Eliot, and various other poets and writers to whom they could, or whose works they could set to music and turn into song. They were quite aware that this wouldn't always sound good because it was so unfamiliar, and so some of the prefaces do include almost an apology, or at least a request to bear with them for the fact that it won't sound good initially. They write in this preface again, this book is issued in a somewhat tentative spirit, yet not without hope that in these days, when all religions of the Western world at least tend to become more practical and less dogmatic, a place may be found for a collection of hymns which contain no theological dogma, but are exclusively concerned with the spiritual aspirations of men in regard to daily life, character, and conduct. And song and collective song was certainly a part of what the Hampstead Society did together and did in their weekly meetings. So meetings of the Society ultimately moved to the large hall of the Hampstead Conservatoire in Swiss Cottage, which was then a private music and arts college and is today part of the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. In 1928, they moved to the Studio Theatre at 59 Finchley Road. And according to Gustav Spiller, numbers that were in attendance at these meetings fluctuated between the lower end of 30 up to 150. up to the end of the First World War, and they regularly averaged 100 during the most flourishing period of the society. But as was the case with many other ethical societies, the Hampstead Ethical Institute saw a sharp decline in attendance after the war. However, unlike a lot of societies, they did have a continuous group right up through until 2015, when they ended as the Hampstead Humanist group. So they had a remarkable longevity compared to lots of the other groups, many of whom did cease in the 1910s or 1920s. Like lots of other ethical societies, in the early years, they had a secular Sunday school. They had a needlework guild, which produced clothing to be distributed amongst charitable institutions, and they had what was called a Pleasant Evening Guild for children, which organised activities and games one evening a week. They also had a popular and again long-standing debating society, which was active between 1903 and 1925. And in 1909, they appointed an official representative to the Hampstead Social Welfare Society, and in 1912 joined the Rationalist Peace Society, which Josephine Gower, who was a long-standing member and secretary of the society, served on as the society's representative. So they were actively involved in both charitable work as a society and also efforts towards, for example, peace. And after the First World War, they joined the League of Nations as a society as well. As mentioned, and I'm not putting these up so that you can carefully necessarily read through every name on the list, just more as a representative, I guess, an illustration of some of what's in the archives. It has been the membership list of the society which have so helped me as a researcher on this project and the Humanist Heritage Project overall, mostly because they give such a good sense, or an actual sense, of who comprised the early movement during the first part of the 20th century, because it's not something that's obvious necessarily, particularly in the kind of histories of the movement that already existed. So to actually see and be able to look up, especially when they've got addresses by the side of them, who these people were and what it was that they were doing, what their occupations were, what their makeup was in terms of men and women within the societies, it's really helps to establish a much better sense and a much better understanding of what that early movement looks like. And it has to be said, somewhat of a lockdown project for me, because having had pictures of some of these subscriber lists for the Hampstead Ethical Institute, I was able to, as I say, look much more carefully into who these people were, and establish a sense of who was drawn to the ethical societies, from what professions, as I say, and also maybe on what account, what was it that particularly drew, for example, women in such large numbers to these societies, and because typically the history of humanism and free thought has been seen as something that's quite masculine and quite male dominated, when actually, certainly in the case of the Hampstead Ethical Institute and the West London Ethical Society, for which we also have very good records, in fact, the makeup is much more evenly split, and sometimes it's actually dominated by women rather than men, including in the leadership as well as the membership. So it really helps to, as I say, to challenge some of those perhaps preconceptions about who made up the societies. It also helps to uncover connections of some perhaps more notable people in history with this movement. When we typically see in history examples of people who have had a strong religious affiliation or a strong religious faith, it is seen, and fairly enough, as significant to their life story and to their motivations. But it's similarly useful, even though it's often overlooked, to identify humanist convictions in association with the humanist movement when they're in evidence, and when we can see. So again, these examples really help with that. So to have a look at some of the kind of representative members, I suppose, that have emerged from a closer examination of the membership lists. I was looking largely at two lists which have survived, so 1906 and 1912, to get a sense of sometimes how long people have been members and also who they were. You might notice from some of the names on this that there are quite a large number of German and Jewish descent, or people of German and Jewish descent, and that seems to fit with a kind of a community or a fairly large German population that was in Hampstead at that time. But you also see healthcare workers and teachers, professional women and suffragists, as well as the very wealthy. And it has to be said that the ethical societies were often, although not exclusively, a fairly middle and upper middle class society, type of society. So number one, Alfred Lewis Bakarak was somebody that came out of these membership lists, and his parents were also members of the society, and he was a member when he was initially still a chemistry student. He ultimately became a food scientist and a musician, and he spent his whole life in Hampstead. He was involved in the Independent Labour Party and the Fabian Society, and also in the Working Men's College. And he was also an accomplished musician and a respected writer on music. He lived for many years and died at 26 Willow Road. And there's this nice description of him as a character that forms part of his Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry, in which the writer Magnus Pike says, "There are some scientists who advance knowledge by working silently in their laboratories. There are others who found businesses or build machines. Bakarak was more than a man of science. He was an outstandingly eclectic man of his time. His major contribution was to make his contemporaries think." Apparently he was an exacting grammarian as well, and he wouldn't stand for any incorrect grammar. And this formed part of a talk that he would go around and deliver to various societies. Another fascinating member of the society, and briefly on the committee of the Hampstead Ethical Institute, was Francis Hardcastle, who was a mathematician, and whose time as a member of the Hampstead Ethical Institute coincides with the period during which she was also joint honorary secretary of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which is why I've got this here. There doesn't seem to exist a picture of her, unfortunately. She subsequently moved to Newcastle, where she served as secretary of the Northeastern Federation of Women's Suffrage Societies, and where she built for her retirement a house with her lifelong partner, Dr. Ethel Williams, who was a former Newcastle GP and her chair of the Northeastern NUWSS. As I say, there's no picture, tragically, of Frances Hardcastle herself, but this is Ethel Williams, her partner, on the side here. And there is this letter she wrote while a secretary of the NUWSS. Correspondence has taken place between the constitutional suffragists and Mr. Asquith, in which the former asked the Premier to receive a deputation from the National Union of Suffrage Societies. This Mr. Asquith refused, saying that he thought no useful purpose would be served by his receiving a deputation. Miss Frances Hardcastle, the honorary secretary of the society, replies in a letter to the press. "We have been encouraged by a member of the cabinet to believe that the Prime Minister would consent, after the great demonstration of June the 13th, to receive a deputation from the constitutional suffragists. A letter to that effect was addressed on June 29th by a cabinet minister to one of the chief members of our executive committee. Our application to Mr. Asquith to receive a deputation, however, met with the curt refusal quoted above, and this was followed almost immediately by his contemptuous reference to women's suffrage at the bar last Friday. Surely no body of voters pressing by constitutional means for a great reform would have been so cavalierly treated by a Prime Minister. It almost suggests the thought that Mr. Asquith wishes to discredit women's suffrage by encouraging unconstitutional methods of agitation." This is particularly interesting because the following year, fellow Ethical Society activist Lily Boileau who was a member of the militant Women's Freedom League, would be arrested on the charge of throwing a cardboard tube containing a petition at Asquith. And she, alongside some of these other figures from the Women's Freedom League, was arrested. She, however, protested this charge, writing that having waited 4 hours to personally present her petition to him, I raised my arm to reach over the shoulders of the police in front of me. My wrist was immediately seized from behind by a plainclothes officer with such force that the roll flew out of my hand and fell, as described, into the gutter behind Mr. Asquith. I may add that our sole purpose in Downing Street was to personally hand our petition to Mr. Asquith, and that object could in no way have been attained by throwing it as suggested. Lily Boileau lived most of her life in Highgate, where she died, according to the ethical record, tending her old world garden. And she was, as I say, as well as being a very active suffragist, a prominent member in the Union of Ethical Societies. After the vote was achieved for women, she continued to work for equal rights, including in St Pancras. And is herself a very fascinating and interesting and little remembered, unfairly figure. But the number of active suffragists and the organisational support for women's suffrage was something that was relatively unknown, or at least underappreciated, before the research started for this project, but it became very evident. So a Miss Hicks was also a member of the Hampstead Ethical Institute. It could have been Amy Maud, who was a suffragist and who is the one that's pictured in this suffrage postcard created by the Women's Freedom League, with her mother, who was also an active suffragist, Lillian Hicks, or it could potentially be her sister Beatrice, who was a teacher. She's just listed as Miss Hicks, so it's hard to know. But this does allow for a brief interlude into the suffragist census boycott of 1911, in which a number of Hampstead Ethical Institute members participated, and participated gleefully. So this is the Hicks's home in Downside Crescent, and it's been written on by Lillian Hicks, head of the household. As I am not regarded as a responsible citizen, I refuse to fill up this census. As I say, although Mrs. Hicks, Lillian Hicks, doesn't appear to have been a member of the society, certainly her daughter was. Beatrice McCabe's census boycott is my personal favourite, and the census boycott, in case you're not familiar with it, was a tactic used by the suffragists, organised or suggested by the Women's Freedom League, to get the vote and to disrupt the census, in order to do so, and to protest the fact that they were counted on the census but not considered citizens enough to vote. Beatrice McCabe's entry is brilliant. She lists every member of her household, including her pets, whose marital status and places of origin are also noted. She tells us whether her goldfish are married and where they came from, her rabbits and where they came from. And she also writes, "I wish here to register in the strongest possible terms my utter detestation of and indignation at having thrust upon me in the absence of my husband the duties and responsibilities of citizenship, when neither I nor any single member of my sex is allowed to exercise the most elementary right of a citizen." Beatrice McCabe had been raised in a free-thinking family. Her father had been a member of the Leicester Secular Society, and that's how she probably met her husband, who was a former priest turned prolific secularist writer called Joseph McCabe. And Beatrice McCabe and Joseph McCabe were both longtime members of the Hampstead Ethical Institute. Here she is, again, a Women's Freedom League postcard, suffragettes at home, just showing that should women be allowed the vote, and should a woman be a suffragist, it wouldn't necessarily mean the destruction of all that was good and holy and domestic. And so they produced this series of postcards showing suffragettes doing normal, homely things, including, in this case, bathing a baby. And this is the marvellous Beatrice McCabe. whether it was this support for suffrage, this active support, and clearly this community within the ethical societies, which was so friendly to the cause and to fellow suffragists, or whether it was the comparative respectability of a free-thinking but not explicitly atheist society, which drew so many women to the ethical movement, is a matter of speculation. I think it's probably a combination of the two, but they really were plentiful. And other members of the Hampstead Ethical Institute included Isabel Grinton Smith, who'd been born in 1857 in Northumberland, who was the first woman to be employed as a higher level civil servant in the London County Council, albeit on 2/3 of the salary of her male counterparts. She was an infant protection visitor, and she was a member of the Hampstead Ethical Institute, alongside another hard worker for the ethical movement, Estella Drucker, who was also a health inspector, and who, as I say, was very active in both the Hampstead Society and the wider movement. Emily Ashurst Holyoke as well was a member of the Hampstead Ethical Institute, and an active trade unionist as well, particularly in encouraging women to join trade unions. She was the daughter of George Jacob Holyoke, who's perhaps most famous for coining the term secularism in 1851 to describe a philosophy that was rooted in what you could do on earth to make changes. But Holyoke himself was, again, very active in all sorts of movements, but particularly the cooperative movement, which clearly filtered down to his daughter, Emily Ashurst. And Alice Vickery on the right here was a physician and the first British woman to qualify as a chemist and a druggist. She was also a campaigner for women's rights, against the concept of illegitimacy. She had both of her children outside of wedlock with her lifelong partner and fellow activist. And she is buried now in Brookwood Cemetery with her gravestone, which remembers her as a pioneer in social work, an original thinker, and an ardent feminist. And she too was a member of the Hampstead Ethical Institute. Also members were Ludwig and Frieda Mond, a chemist and a philanthropist respectively. Although of Jewish descent, Ludwig Mond never practiced any religion, and the couple raised their children without any religious faith. Frieda Mond was a lover of art and literature, and she gave a very generous endowment to the British Academy, establishing a language and literature fund, which she initially remained anonymous for. She served on the committee of the English Goethe Society and helped to establish a Goethe scholarship. And she also amassed a large collection of memorabilia related to German literature in particular. This house was their home near Regent's Park, called the Poplars, which housed, as well as them, their large collection of art, sculpture and literature, and became the meeting place for a wide circle of friends. Ludwig Mond reportedly said that he knew only one woman who could live without religion, and that was Frieda. So we get, again, an interesting insight into both some of the characters who populated the societies and also how they conceived of themselves or were conceived of by others when we start to dig down a bit more into who they actually were. And some names, even though they're little remembered outside the ethical societies, start to become very familiar when you look through the list of members and subscribers, such as the Muirhead family, and among them Finlay Muirhead, who was a graduate of Edinburgh University, along with his brother James, became responsible for the English language Baedeker guides, compiling guides to Britain, the US and Canada. And others, like Mary Gilliland Husband and Josephine Gower, were extraordinarily active in areas spanning charity work, pacifism, all sorts of social reform, including efforts for suffrage. But they've otherwise left few ripples in history, and until this project began, relatively few ripples even in the history of the movement itself, which seems tremendously unjust because they were so significant in these early years, as all of these people were, as members of the societies and as parts of the community that comprised the overall movement. But, and this is where I'll kind of, I suppose, draw it to a close on that thought, in examining the minute books and drawing on other resources, combining sources from within and without the ethical movement, you can start to build a picture of some of the real people who made up these societies, which is sometimes lost when we're talking about a movement with a very long history like this one. So by joining official data with descriptions of ordinary people's lives recalled by those who knew them, or sometimes in newspaper reports or however else we're receiving information about them, we can just build up a much more accurate picture of who it was that that formed and really propelled this movement. And needless to say, and of course I'm biased, but a lot of nearly forgotten women who make up that early history. People like Jane Christie, who I know very little about beyond the fact that she was a member of the Hampstead Ethical Institute. She was born in 1826 in France, and she died at home on Lambole Road. And her obituary in the Ethical Record, which was the journal of the South Place Society, offers the kind of account of who she actually was that can only really arise from these kind of records where you get just a little bit more from that sense of community or congregation. She was an example to us all. The keen interest she took in everything that went on in the world about her and in all matters of progress and reform up to a few weeks ago was truly marvellous. One of the links with the happy past has been broken for me. I shall miss her sadly, yet we must not regret her passing away. She has lived a long, active and useful life, and what more ought one to desire? And I'm going to end on the largely unknown Jane Christie. Oh, actually, I will just mention that there is a Bloomsbury self-led tour, which is on an app called Go Jauntly. If you're inclined to use apps, and if you are interested in taking a look at it and a look at a different part of the history, but still very much in Camden, then please do find it on Go Jauntly if you're interested. Otherwise, please do just look at the website if you want to find out a bit more about some of the people I've mentioned, or some of the groups, and similarly feel free to contact me in any way should you desire. But otherwise, thank you very much for hanging on in there for what's been a very long talk. I'm very grateful for you spending your Thursday evening, at least somewhat, with me. So thank you.
Ruth?
Right. Thank you very much indeed, Maddie. That was wonderful. I mean, just such interesting characters. What you can do when you sort of just start to drill down from just the merest detail and then find the sort of information that you have. That's so impressive. Now, Malcolm, our chairman, is here and would like to ask a question. So I'll hand over to you, Malcolm.
Fine, thank you. Some years ago, I had quite a lot of dealings with people from the Humanist Housing Association, which later merged with an old Camden Housing Association called the St Pancras Housing Association, and was called for some years St Pancras and Humanist Housing Association. It's now been renamed as Origin. Clearly from the list of properties that they had, and I suspect nearly all of them left in individuals' wills, it wasn't a particularly local organisation. But one thing I don't know is really much about its early history. Is it something that you know was an early history, or is it much more of recent origin?
So that began as the Ethical Union Housing Association in 1955, I think their first meeting was, and it was a group of kind of particularly active members of the Ethical Union, as it then was, who essentially wanted, again, to be a bit more practical in their philosophies, and they identified a need. It was the same decade that also saw the emergence of the Agnostics Adoption Society, which similarly kind of addressed a need that they saw, and later on a humanist counselling service as well. But essentially and there is a really good, which I'm happy to find and share, there's a really good kind of PDF history of the Humanist Housing Association, which is what it became, which kind of takes you through the development of it. So initially, I think they essentially fundraised to purchase the first house, which they then converted, and they kind of gradually obtained more and more through I think a combination of really donations and probably, as you say, some bequests and other kind of forms of fundraising, and it grew to a much kind of larger portfolio of houses, but lots of them took the names of figures that had been really involved. So Rosebush House is one, Burnett House I think is another, named after two a husband and wife who were both very involved. I think there might be a Blackham House as well, and H.J. Blackham was a kind of leading figure at the time, but I'm very happy to find that that document and share it. There is a page on the Humanist Heritage website about the Humanist Housing Association, so some of it's there, but yeah, it started in the 50s.
Oh, right, thank you very much.
Right. Anybody else got a question? Absolutely nobody else got a question or want to comment on anything?
Just wanted to say that there are
hello, Lindsay.
Hello, there are two very warm thanks in the chat where two people have said thank you for a very fascinating talk, who enjoyed it very much, but that's in the chat.
Yes, but no questions there, mercifully, in a way.
No
yes,
pressure
I think
to have
people
questions.
know. That's lovely.
If they occur to you later, or if you have any points or thoughts, then you can always get in touch. Chris?
Hello, Chris. Lovely.
Yes, hello. I was just going to say, what kind of reactions were evoked by the appearance of these humanist ethical societies and so on? Were people generally accepting of them, or was there a lot of opposition? Was there public opposition, especially when they were linked with notions like suffragettes and so on? You know, there were a lot of reasons why they might be attacked, but what was the sort of ambiance?
So it was mixed. I think generally it was slightly more favourable than perhaps some of the earlier, more, I guess, militantly atheist, for want of a better phrase, societies. So, for example, the secular societies, the National Secular Society, having been formed in 1866, came under much more, or came into much more opposition because it was deemed to really be attacking the church and attacking religious groups. Whereas the ethical societies, and I think it was very deliberately not antagonistic in that way, and they didn't require members to disavow religion. It wasn't about being in opposition to religion. It was just about agreeing that you could still work for good or work for positive change without being religiously affiliated, or without agreeing on things like, you know, the concept of an afterlife or the existence of a God. So by and large, they seem to have been fairly well received. There was a few accusations, particularly in the kind of earlier years, so the 1880s, 1890s, of being atheist societies, and that word still carried a lot of weight in a negative way, and so that was really where they kind of came under question, and for individual societies, sometimes depending on the subject of different lectures and things, they might receive unfavourable press. So if they had a particular speaker talking about something which was deemed to be, for example, particularly challenging to religion or to the church, then sometimes that would provoke a reaction, particularly in kind of local press, and that varies right across the UK really. I mean, yeah, you had societies in Northern Ireland and you know, places where it was, I guess, much maybe more difficult even then to be seen to be irreligious, or to be accused of it. But I think this is one of the reasons that people like women were drawn to it in quite large numbers, because it was a relatively respectable way of perhaps dwelling in religious doubt, but without positioning yourself as kind of anti-religious or anti-church. It was almost yeah, like I say, just a bit more respectable, a bit more welcoming maybe. So I think that's why. And they were called ethical societies. The focus was very much on ethics. And again, I think that was a deliberate thing as well. It's harder to attack something which is making moral action its crux, I suppose.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that. In fact, Chris is the author of a book on St Mary's Primrose Hill, which celebrated its 150th anniversary this year. So he is very familiar with the use of particular archives. In fact, very influential in general in the area of archives, I would say, and all to the good. So you're part or using the standard as well to dig down into archives. So I think with that, I think I shall draw this to a close and thank Maddie very much for a fascinating talk. I'm sorry that we didn't have so many people in on this. Oh, Malcolm, you're wanting to say something again? Malcolm?
I think it's just the little clapping hands.
Oh, it's the clapping hands, right.
Much
okay.
appreciated.
Thank you very much. And
thanks very much.
Goodbye. Good evening.